Good morning. It is chilly here today. We got a cold front coming through in Florida, so you're going to see me all bundled up. It was in the 40s this morning, which to us is ice cold. So, this is episode 2 of the food for pleasure versus food for fuel series that I'm doing. And today, we are going to talk about sugar. And I want to start with why we are drawn to sugar and why it is so tempting for us and pleasurable to the palate and that type of thing. So, sugar actually stimulates the brain's reward system, and it affects our neurotransmitters that promote a sense of well-being. So when you hear that, you can understand why this is something that we are drawn to. If you're going to get a biological response of pleasure, this is something that innately we are seeking out as mammals. Okay, so sugar provides energy and promotes fat storage. So this is also something obviously we're going to be drawn to, because not only are we getting a positive response with our brain, but also, as I said in my last video, we are going to be looking for ways of surviving. So if there is a food that promotes fat storage, that is something we will be drawn to, because your body wants to store as much fat as possible, because that is a means of survival. Okay? So I wrote here, we are innately conditioned to want foods that assist with longevity and survival. So if we have more sugar, that leads to more fat storage, which leads to longer survival. So this is a natural thing for us. So sugar becomes addictive, and in recovery, we see this quite a bit. People, like myself included, who give up drugs or alcohol, which is a very simple sugar. Alcohol is just a form of sugar, in case you didn't know that. Oftentimes in recovery, we'll see people replace drugs and alcohol with eating a lot of sugary foods. And in fact, the overeating of sugars is oftentimes encouraged or celebrated in recovery, because people will say things like, no one ever got arrested or lost their kids from eating 12 donuts. Which, you can chuckle and say that that is true. However, swapping one unhealthy behavior just for another one is obviously long term not a good practice. So that is something that happened to me. I gave up drinking, and then I started overeating instead, which I never had a problem with in the past. And I gained over 20 pounds because of that. But it was still celebrated, because it was like, you're not drinking alcohol anymore, so what's the big deal? There was no acknowledgement of that could create poor body image, that could create food addiction, that could create eating disorders or disordered eating. And, in the recovery world, that's not really discussed that much, and it should be, because really what you're doing is you're getting rid of one unhealthy habit and then bringing on a new one, which is just equally unhealthy in the long run. So my next video, I'm going to be talking about how these evolutionary innate programs in our DNA promote habits like overeating, poor food choices, and how that can become a spiral of, number 1, urges and temptation. Number 2 is craving and consumption. Number 3 would be addiction and compulsion. That's to the food. And number 4, the habits and poor health. Okay, so we are drawn to these foods. So is it your fault that you're drawn to sugary foods and you want to eat them? Well, yes and no. We are born with neurotransmitters in our brains that seek pleasure and avoid pain. That is how we are innately built. That is what we're going to do if my daughter right now is reading Lord of the Flies, if we're all abandoned out on an island and we start resorting back to our animalistic nature, this is part of our animalistic nature, to seek pleasure, avoid pain, and to seek out ways to reproduce. That is what we do as mammals. Okay? So we get a dopamine surge when we consume sugar in the same way as when you use cocaine and heroin. Now, I don't know how many people watching this use cocaine and heroin. Hopefully, no one. But it is the same type of biological response in your brain. You get a dopamine surge when you eat these things. So understanding this, I think, can be very helpful to people, because then you take away this mystery or this guilt or this terrible feeling of, why am I built this way? To be so drawn to doing these types of behaviors, to eating these types of foods, and having this continuous cycle of consumption, guilt, and then going back to wanting it, consumption, guilt, things of that nature. Okay. So there were actually rats in a study, and they were deprived of food for 12 hours and then given sucrose, and they started binging. So that setup created a binge response in these rats. And even after the sucrose was taken away, because they had developed the habit of binging, they kept binging. So that's very interesting, isn't it? So you see this in the diet world, right? We restrict our calories, 12 hours of not eating. We do that probably every night. A fast of 12 hours. So if you're starting your day with something sugary, then you're setting yourself up for a binge behavior later on in the day. So if we can recognize these patterns and how they affect us biologically, we can then make different choices, maybe a breakfast with no sugar, to not set yourself up biologically to do binging type of behaviors throughout the day. Okay, so these rats created this dopamine desire and a habit. So, we have the dopamine release, we have the consumption of the sugar, and then we have the habit of the binging. These are all very, very difficult things to combat once you have them in play as a routine in your life. Okay, so over time, sugar and drugs alter our dopamine receptors, so that just like taking drugs, we want and need more in order to feel the same pleasurable response. So what that's meaning is, your dopamine receptors just become more numb. And so this is why people who take drugs or eat sugar, same type of response. You need more in order to get the same pleasurable response. And we see that with drugs, that's totally socially accepted when it comes to addiction, because we see people who do drugs, eventually they take more drugs in order to get the same response, right? Well, the same is true for consumption of sugar. In the beginning, we have these, we taste the sugar, it tastes great, we get the dopamine response, we have a well-being feeling that is inside our brain going on, which is a biological thing. And then over time, this just becomes more desensitized. So it takes more sugar more often in order to get that pleasurable feeling, which we discussed is an evolutionary thing that we seek out as mammals. We seek out pleasure and avoid pain. So this is creating a cycle for us of more sugar, more dopamine, more pleasure feeling, and then, it crashes back down again, and the cycle repeats itself with the wanting, consumption, dopamine release, the crash, etc. Okay, so what do we do about this? Okay, we want to educate ourselves on these biological processes of dopamine surge, the neurotransmitters being changed and numbed by this overproduction of dopamine due to the high sugar consumption. Once we understand these things, it's easier to take a more, I would say, systematic approach at our habits by knowing this is how I was made, this is how my body responds to these substances, meaning sugar and fat and high caloric foods, and this is why I need to change my habits in order to, live a healthier life. Once you understand how you're wired, you can create peace around knowing why we crave sugar in the first place, why we want more sugar when we have it on a regular basis, and what is happening in our brains to keep this process going as well as growing. Okay? So now that we know this, we can pull ourselves away from sugar, knowing that there will be a natural withdrawal period. I see oftentimes people experiencing this when they pull away from sugar. It's like, gosh, I didn't know how much I wanted that and how much I was addicted to that until I stopped the behavior and stopped the consumption. Okay? So there'll be a natural withdrawal period, usually that lasts about a week, and our brain has an opportunity then to acclimate to the lack of the dopamine surges, and our brain returns more to a homeostatic state with increased sensitivity to dopamine, the numbing of the increased dopamine being released, right? Our neuroreceptors then become more sensitive, just like you can become more insulin sensitive when you decrease your sugar consumption in smaller quantities, okay? So lastly, my next video will be about the habits that we perpetuate because of being drawn to these foods, and so that'll be the next episode in this series. But lastly, I want to let you know that this process creates these habits. Okay, so we're going through this series starting to get educated about how we are made biologically, how the way we eat affects us neurologically, and why we are drawn to these types of behaviors, these foods, these cravings and temptations and whatnot. Okay, so we recognize our unhealthy habits around eating sugary and fatty and high calorically dense foods, why we crave these types of foods, and how to break the cycle of wanting, indulging, guilt, craving again, and that's how the cycle goes, right? We get the idea of eating the sugary foods, we may see the sugary or fatty foods, we get this innate craving because we seek pleasure. Our body knows that if we eat these foods, we're going to get a dopamine surge. So when we see those types of things, we do have a pull toward it because our body is looking to survive, right? Our body knows if I eat this sugary food, not only am I going to get a feeling of well-being from the pleasure and the dopamine surge, but also your body knows that I will be able to store fat more easily if I consume this sugar. So that will promote my longevity and survival, another pull toward those foods, right? But then as women or men in this culture today, with guilt and shame and all of that being perpetuated, once we consume those things, get those feelings, the crash comes about, right? The dopamine is now being processed and being eliminated. Here comes the guilt and the shame. Why did I do that? Why did I indulge? What came over me to do that? I have felt all these things. I used to go to church and I would purposely eat my breakfast before I went to church, and I would tell myself every week, I'm not going to eat from that buffet table. And every single week I would fail. Every single week. And I remember I would stand during the Bible study lesson at the buffet table, and I would just be like, I'm just taking one piece. I would take one piece, and then it would start the dopamine response, right? Okay, I'm going to take another piece. I'm going to take another piece. And every single time I went, every single week, I would eat a good amount of food and then leave feeling like, what is wrong with me? Why can't I get this under control? Why do I keep eating these foods? And it's because of this whole story. It's because when placed in a situation like that, on a diet of barely any sugar, especially in a calorie deficit, right? I'm already setting myself up for being kind of hungry when I go into any of these things. I'm not in a position where I can resist these sugary, high-fat foods. It's just kind of a setup for I'm not going to say disaster, because that's just too, doom and gloom. It's a setup for temptation, right? So these are the types of things we want to learn about so that we can figure out how to deprogram ourselves just enough to have healthy habits and to have healthy relationships and understanding with these types of foods, so that we can have a moderate approach to our diet by eating in a healthy way most of the time, and then eating in a pleasurable way in a moderate and smaller amount of time. Okay, so that's all I have for you today. Our next video will be more focused on habits and how we create these habits and why, and what to do about unhealthy habits with food and how to create more healthy habits with food. So have a great day, and I'll see you next time. Bye-bye.